So we're in a position where you can look at this and say, can we come up with a better regulatory structure that at least has a better shot in the future of being able to eliminate some of these problems and some of the gaps? And let me give you a very simple, easy vision to think about with regard to that. Look at the various goals that regulators have. One is systemic risk. Another one, for example, is entity solvency. Both the SEC and the banking regulators care about the solvency of entities. You care about, for example, ensuring that if you have your money in a brokerage or your money in a bank, that you as an individual can get it back, regardless of whether or not that brokerage or that bank's going under would create any kind of systemic risk. That's something that individuals care about. And you care about that from the regulatory perspective of having an efficient market for those kinds of deposits, because you don't want any individual depositor or any individual brokerage customer to have to sit there and analyze the balance sheet and the financial statement of every bank they might put their money into to decide whether or not it's safe. And so you want people to feel that their money is going to be safe, so you don't get runs on banks, so that we don't have the same kind of mistake that we had with regard to the Depression, and so that you can have lots of other competition than just simply having only the biggest banks presumably be the ones that can actually acquire deposits. And so you care about entity solvency. You also care a lot about markets. Are they efficient? Are they fair? Are they deep? Are they transparent? Are they working right? And therefore you want somebody who understands markets well. And then last, you want to, in essence, protect investors, protect consumers, protect the folks from a, if you will, the financial consumer perspective. If you look at the regulatory goals of agencies from that perspective, what do you realize is that you need basically focus on those 4 kinds of goals. And there aren't really very many other goals than those. But we don't have any regulator who focuses on one of those goals only. We have a Fed that purports to do consumer protection at the same time it thinks about systemic risk, at the same time it worries a little bit about entity solvency for large entities. You've got banking regulators who really focus primarily on entity solvency, but we talk to them about looking at systemic risk as well, and we also charge them with doing consumer protection. We have the SEC, which focuses primarily, if you will, on investor/consumer protection, has some ability and does care a lot about entity solvency with regard to brokerages from the perspective of consumer protection, but doesn't really have very much of a say and doesn't have enough insight, not because it can't, but because it simply doesn't have the jurisdiction to look at, for example, the overall structure of a large investment banking operation that has broker-dealers as subs, but for which the parent companies are not directly regulated. And in any event, it can't really look at systemic risk because it doesn't have any jurisdiction over banks or large insurance companies, et cetera. And then you've got the CFTC, which does a pretty admirable job of looking at the regulation of markets for which it has jurisdiction, but that's really about as far as it can go. And so we don't have any regulators who can really focus on, across the board, what it is that we're asking them to do. We have them all doing various kinds of things because we have a regulatory structure that's 80 years old, that's focused on definitions, that's focused on the regulation of securities and those who issue them and those who sell and trade them. We're focused on banks and bank products, and consequently we look at a banking regulator. We focus on insurance, viewing insurance and those who provide insurance as one area to regulate. And the CFTC has a little bit of a hybrid jurisdiction, primarily focusing on markets that are not securities. And so you've got this mishmash of regulatory agencies. Not only do they overlap, but there are also chasms, gaps, into which basically a lot of the economy fell in the last year and a half between the regulators, where nobody's responsible for certain things. Nobody really sat there and said, we've got to look at mortgage brokers. Nobody sat there and said, not what will happen if we have securities that are collateralized obligations or that are backed by tranches of mortgages. Clearly the SEC actually did its job with regard to those securities to the extent they were publicly offered and subject to its jurisdiction. It ensured that there was full and fair disclosure. But the SEC's job was not to then determine whether or not there was too much potential risk with regard to those securities for large institutions to hold them, whether or not that, were there to be a systemic default because the economy as a whole might actually have mortgage problems, that you would end up with systemic risk throughout the entire economy. That's just not the SEC's job. The Fed didn't look at that, and the Fed didn't actually have jurisdiction over a lot of the insurance companies, and the Fed didn't, as we know, have jurisdiction directly, at least with regard to a lot of the large investment banks, until they became bank holding companies. And so you've got a whole series of regulatory gaps, large chasms, and you have, in many of the cases that we have looked at over the last couple of years of the cause of our current debacle, failures of anyone to be responsible or accountable for actually doing much of anything with regard to regulating the potential problems that came up. And so to some degree, some of the proposals today on the Hill are designed to at least try to plug some of those gaps. The CFPA, for example, is intending to try to reach an area that nobody currently spends much time and attention on now in terms of the regulation of certain consumer financial products. That, to my mind, is a good idea, regardless of whether or not you think regulatory oversight is going to add a lot of value or only a little value. Right now, there's none with regard to much of that, and it needs to have some. Regardless of whether or not you think that the SEC has done a great job, Madoff and other things notwithstanding, the SEC is a great enforcement agency. It can do a good job in the securities area, but it needs to be able to, or there could be an entity that looks at investor protection and consumer financial protection all as one idea. I disagree with the notion of having a separate agency that does certain kinds of bank and insurance products and the SEC doing investment products. I think it'd be better if they were one agency that looked at it from a consumer protection perspective across the board. But if you can't get that done, at least get two out there and then worry about whether or not you put them together some other time. But we're in a position right now where if we don't make some of these changes, if we don't close some of the regulatory gaps, and I would also agree that we ought to ensure, if we could, to eliminate some of the regulatory overlap, because I think that's just simply a deadweight loss. But if we don't basically close some of these regulatory gaps, we're going to be in a position where we're doomed to repeat not only mistakes that we can't currently see, but we're doomed to repeat the mistakes that we already know that we ought to be able to fix. And that would be a real shame. So if anything we can learn, if there is something that we can learn from this, it's that at least we ought to close the barn door before the horse gets out again, because there will be another barn and there will be another set of horses. And we ought to be in a position to at least make sure we don't allow this same mistake to repeat itself. Otherwise, that would be really stupid of us. That would be real intellectual hazard. And if we're in a position to at least ensure that this gap doesn't continue to occur, we have a better shot of at least potentially looking at what the next gap is that might occur and being in a position to solve for it. There's a saying that, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. We're not dead yet. So I think we're in a position where if we can learn from this, we're actually going to come out of this with a better regulatory structure than the one we currently have. But I do think that if we ask regulators to foresee the next problem, when people in this room couldn't with regard to their own money, and nobody can with regard to some of these things, I think we're asking regulators to do too much. I think we're expecting government to do too much. I don't think government can do those things. But if we don't try to make the government and regulatory structure better and reform it from a structure that was put in place literally almost 100 years ago, then we're doomed to basically repeat some of the same failures that we're currently seeing. So that's basically it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Professor Miller?
Well, I was extremely impressed by Chairman Pitt and Mr. Wallman's comments. They both come up with creative approaches to our regulatory dilemma. Chairman Pitt's idea of the Uber regulator, I always avoid German stuff, but that's the Uber regulator is an interesting idea. And Mr. Wallman's idea is of goal-based regulation, where we create regulatory agencies with specific functional goals in mind as opposed to the current system. Both of those are very appealing in different ways, but also attractive. But I also want to express certain skepticism. It's a big dilemma now when you think about what to do. It's obvious that there was a serious shortfall, a serious lack of adequate regulatory supervision. So we think we ought to do something. But on the other hand, we have to be careful about what we do. So we don't want to react too quickly. We don't want to have a system of regulation, and I don't think either of my co-panelists are doing this, but some people are. We just have to do something and do it quickly. It doesn't matter what it is. Well, those kinds of regulatory approaches never work. They're like rebound relationships. You know, those never work. Just making a change in regulation because something went wrong isn't going to work. And I also worry, to continue Mr. Wallman's barn door image or metaphor, that what we're going to do is slam the barn door to not let the horse get back in. And we're going to make it worse than it was before. So those are concerns.